What's going on, everyone? This is Mr. Elliott again from Miss Crowley's 6th grade class here at New Beginnings Family Academy. Today was April 7th. You guys were sent home a packet, some homework, just kind of reviewing what we've been going over in math for the last couple weeks. Some of that had to do with plotting integers on a number line, finding the opposite of a particular number, and absolute value, which I'll go over once I clear this off the board here. But really quick, we're just going to have a review. So plotting integers. Now we know integers they can be negative or they can be positive, but they are always, it's a whole number. So plotting, some of the homework had to do with plotting integers on a number line. So here's a number line here. If I was going to plot the number 2, so if the question asks you to plot the number 2 on the number line, we're simply just putting a circle there. Finding where 2 is, putting a circle there. If it asks you to plot the number -5 here on the number line, we find -5 here, which is going to be to the left, and we put a circle there. That's plotting a number on a number line. Very simple, simple enough, right? So then, the review of our finding the opposite of an opposite, or finding the opposite first. Let's start there, okay? So we'll go from reviewing how to find the opposite of a number to reviewing the opposite of the opposite. So here I have a whole number, 5, an integer of 5, and then I have -5. The opposite of 5 is -5. So let's kind of use our number line again here. If I have the +2 that I first plotted before, what would be the opposite of that +2? It would be -2. What would be the opposite of -5? It would be 5, right? So I have the integer of -2. The opposite would be then 2. Or if I started with the positive number, 2, then the opposite is it's -2. Vice versa, same way. What about another one? If I choose 4, what would be the opposite of 4? Then it would be -4. If I had -7, what would be the opposite of -7? It would be +7. Simple enough, all right? So now let's go over, just going to erase this here, and let's go over the opposite of the opposite. Now we have a rule here that we went over in classes. The opposite of the opposite is always the original number. So what does that mean? Well, as I had here before, I had -5, right? What would be the opposite of -5? We know it would be 5. What would be the opposite of 5? It would be -5. So the opposite of the opposite of -5 is -5. So that's how we see our rule come into play. The opposite of the opposite of the opposite is always the original number. We started with -5, we end up right back at -5 again. So with any number, let's start with a positive number. I want you to find what's the opposite of the opposite for 2. The opposite of the opposite for 2 is going to be 2. The opposite of the opposite is always the original number. Okay? Fair enough. All right. Now, we went over briefly also, I don't know if Miss Crowley had decided to put this in your packet, but I'm just going to go over it briefly anyways, just so that you guys can refer back to this video, rewind, fast forward through it. I tell you guys that all the time, right? That's the great thing about video. You can pause it, kind of review only the parts that you need review on. So I'm just going to erase this here. All right, so let's say you have a problem on your worksheet that says, I want you to write an equation for this question here. What's the opposite of the opposite of 3? Okay? So remember we went over in class that this dash here is used as our symbol for the opposite of a number, okay? So when I say I want an equation that shows me the opposite of 3, what will that look like? Okay, so this is the opposite, right? This is the opposite symbol. That I'm going to use. So the opposite of the opposite of 3 should look like this. Okay? The opposite, my symbol for the opposite of the opposite of 3. And what do we know? What's our rule that we went over before? The opposite of any number is always the original number, correct? So what would be the answer to this? What's the opposite of 3? It would be 3. Okay? Let's try another one. Remember, this is practicing how we write that opposite of the opposite type of statement. How do we put that into an equation? How do we put that question into an equation format? So let's say I want to know what's the opposite of the opposite. Let's change this number here. Let's say I want you to write an equation for the opposite of -2. Okay, what's that going to look like? So I have the opposite, my symbol there, of the opposite, right? And then my number that I have in question, I'm going to put in parentheses, right? Just like I had 3 was the number in question here. The number in question here is -2, right? I want to find the opposite of -2. All right, and then I'm going to close the parentheses that I put here. Equals what? The opposite of any number is the original number. The opposite of -2 then is -2. Very good. Where you need help on? All right, so this is going to just be about absolute value. Really quickly, remember absolute value is always positive, okay? And I think for some of our homework, if I'm not mistaken, that we had in the past, I'm just going to do a quick number line here. Some of the questions posed to you on the worksheet would be something like, you had kind of 2 spaces here for each problem. So that's problem number 1 had 2 spaces. Then you had problem number 2 had 2 spaces, and 3 had 2 spaces, and so on. And you were supposed to, for each one, tell me what the number was that was plotted on the number line, and then what was the absolute value of that number. Okay, so I'm just going to do 3 here really quickly. All right, so let's say this was this number line. Let's say this is the number line you had for problem number 1. Okay, here's problem number 1 where you would write the answer for problem number 1 in these 2 spaces. Okay, and then for problem number 1 on the number line, you see a dot plotted here at the -2 point. Okay, so what would be the answer if I say for the number line for problem number 1, at what point do you see the dot plotted on the line? Where is the dot plotted on the line for number 1? You would say, oh, it's at -2. Okay. Or if it asked you, it said, what's the value of the point plotted on the line? You would say -2. All right? And then for the next space, it would ask you something like, what is the absolute value of this point? Okay? So the absolute value, remember, is always positive. And this is how we write absolute value for a particular number, is it has these 2 lines here. The number is inside these 2 lines. All right? So that's how we would write the symbol, so to speak, for the absolute value of -2. So the absolute value of -2 is just 2. All right? Now, another way we also described it is absolute value just being simply the number of spaces from 0. Okay? Because if you look at it as just the number of spaces from 0, then you see how absolute value is always positive, right? So even though this point is plotted at -2, we know that this -2 here is how many spaces from 0 though. Let's count. 1, 2. It's only 2 spaces from 0. You see how that's positive? So it doesn't matter how many spaces from 0 in that direction, in the left direction, where the numbers can, be negative infinity, even if it was -100 way down here, okay? How many spaces would -100 be from 0? It would be 100 spaces, okay? So what would be the absolute value of -100? It would be 100. The absolute value of -2, simply 2. Even in this direction, to the right direction, positive. It's all about the spaces from 0. How many spaces from 0? So we have 4 plotted here on the number line. How many spaces from 0 is that? 1, 2, 3, 4. Absolute value of 4. So just keep that in mind. I know on one of your review worksheets for the spring break packet that you have this as one of the worksheets reviewing absolute value. And just like I said, fast forward through the video, pause it if you need to get some help. I hope you guys have a very happy and enjoyable spring break. You be safe, and I look forward to seeing you guys in class the following Monday.